When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
This episode is brought to you by Heyday. Looking to escape all the festive chaos? Turn holiday hecticness into harmony with Heyday, the mobile game that helps you harvest calm, one crop at a time. Reclaim your me time. Relax, decorate, and enjoy farming bliss as you tend to your animals and harvest crops as part of a welcoming, stress-free community. Join over 20 million players. Just tap or click on the banner now to download Heyday for free today.
Welcome back to Crime Capsule. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. So, Crime Capsule veterans know him as the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain. Our producer, Bill Huffman. Bill is with us every week, making sure that things stay nice and smooth behind the scenes, and usually rescuing me from some stupid technical glitch that is nearly always my fault. But if you're new here, you may not know that Bill is not just a skilled producer. He is also a show host in his own right of the award-winning top podcast, Who Killed? He's also a longtime journalist whose experience and knowledge of the news industry goes back over 20 years. Well, we've got a special treat for everyone as part of our holiday grab bag season. This past week, Bill was kind enough to invite me on to Who Killed to talk about the art and craft of research in historical writing, a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but also a topic that I'm sure a number of folks out there are interested in as well. Bill is hard at work on his own book about a murder that hit close to home where he grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, a cold case file that is still under investigation today. If you have ever written a work of nonfiction or true crime history, or if you have ever wanted to, then this conversation, this episode, is for you. So happy holidays, everybody, and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed? I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen podcast, and Killer podcast production. This week we have a little bit of a special episode. We're going to do a crossover with the other show I produce, Crime Capsule. And I'm happy to welcome back to the show, Benjamin Morris. How are you, Ben?
Doing great, thanks. Really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely, man. We've spent a few years producing and working together, and I have heard you talk many times about how the sausage is made, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about this week in this bonus episode, because it's not so much about the cases, it's about the process. And Ben is an expert in the process of research. He has written books and done this podcast for a number of years, and he has also taught a class at one point about how to do certain research. So this week, we are going to talk about that. So Ben.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to do so. You know, I think a lot of folks out there have ideas about stories they want to tell, but they're not entirely sure about how to go about doing that, you know? And so discussions about process and methods are always helpful. Back when I was doing my graduate training, I did a PhD in archaeology and anthropology some years ago. The methods classes were always just the most oversubscribed. You know, you always wanted to think about how do you get your material, what do you do with it, how do you organize it. And since then, it's been, I'm not going to say exactly how many years since I defended and graduated, but there were some books in the meantime, and all of those books that I wrote involved direct application of those considerations. So it's fun to think about, it's fun to talk about, and I think there are some really useful principles and tools that are out there for anyone who wants to talk about research work. So I'm looking forward to just diving in with you.
Yeah, it's one of those things when you set off to do a project or anything like a podcast or write a book, it's a daunting experience. You look at it and you just think, oh my, how am I going to do this? And you can do it just in a like there is a step-by-step process that can make it manageable. And I think a lot of people out there are afraid of getting in too deep, or they just don't know where to start. And I think by us talking about that, I think, hey, maybe there's going to be some people that are, have some eyes opened about what their abilities are, and maybe want to explore, what makes them passionate about, telling long-form stories. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
The greatest thing about the podcast medium, and I've said that before many times, coming from a news background where you have a minute, 2-minute story package, and it's tough to get across the message. And when you do a research project or like a deep dive, I know you hate that word, but a deep dive into a case like I did with the Amy Mihaljevic case, and you spend months researching it, and eventually turns into years. It's just I don't know, you become used to what your process is, but it can be challenging for other people that haven't done it yet. And I think this week we should open some eyes to how to get it done.
I think so. And one of the things that often overwhelms people is just volume of material. So one of the things I want to just kind of think about together is how do you take stock of what you have? How do you triage it? How do you organize it? And then what do you do with it? And I think those are when you have an extremely complex case like the one you're working on, Amy's case, or anything that you might encounter out there in the wild, you need a system. You have to have a system, and if you don't have a system, you're going to be in some trouble. So I'm just happy to share some of the things that I've learned over the years, some of the things that, some of the tools that I've found, useful, and we'll go from there. I think often, one of the first things that people really do have to decide, and this is a little bird's eye view, but the very first question, which always comes up, of course, is story. What kind of story do you want to tell, and what is out there capturing your imagination? Sometimes it can be an individual person, sometimes it can be the history of a place or a time period. There are interesting books out there about the history of certain inventions. I think of Henry Petrovsky's book on the invention of the pencil, right? I mean, anything can capture somebody's attention as far as like the story that they're interested in. But that's one of the first and most grounding principles is, decide what you want to write about. Now, I will say this, then I've got a question for you, Bill, which is, I've often found the most important guideline here for narrowing down your material involves concentric circles, right? So you want to think about the big topics first, right? You've got, say, American politics, right? Then you want to think about American politics as it plays out regionally. Let's get a little narrower. Then you want to think about your time period. I think of like civil rights movements in the 60s, right? Narrow that down. That's still pretty big. Maybe you want to start looking at particular states or particular individuals who were involved in those movements, right? Maybe you want to look at, violence on a particular occasion, what happened there, right? Eventually, the narrower and narrower you get with your concentric circles, you're going to end up with a really precise and important research question, such as, I'll give you an example from my neck of the woods. Who was the guy that killed the civil rights activist Vernon Dahmer, and where did he go, and what happened to him? And that is how you end up with a book like the wonderful new volume by the investigative journalist Curtis Wilkie, who I know you've heard of, who wrote this book called When Evil Lived in Laurel. And you sort of you take the biggest possible topic first, and you drill down and down and down until you arrive at something like really specific and I'm going to make up a word here, interrogatable, right? And I think that helps us frame our stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely when I look at the Amy case and I look at the amount of archival stuff that's been out there that's, going back to 1989, almost 35 years of news stories and parceling through what is what and what is real, what is an update, what is just an anniversary reminder. I mean, I think when you see all that stuff and then people have written a book about the case. So, shout out to James Renner. And it's one of those things where you look at the fact that the case wasn't ever solved. You always end up with, well, how do you resolve that in the book to make it still an interesting story to tell? Because at the end of the day, like I said, the case isn't solved, and you want people to be invested in the case because this is a tragedy that occurred. And again, how do you do that? I mean, that's really the where I kind of look at it and I go, oh my, that's a lot of stuff. And how do I figure out what it is that would make the most sense?
Absolutely. And when you have that much over a period of going on 35 years, I guess, for Amy now, is that right? Since 89 to 24, yeah. You really have to start making some very broad decisions, sort of, global level decisions about what kind of material you have, what kind you can get access to, and what you're going to include. So in research world, we often make a very important distinction just right up front as far as data gathering goes between, and I'm sure some of your listeners will be familiar with this distinction, but maybe there's some out there who are not. It is absolutely sort of intro level history 101 kind of distinction, but it has to be said, the difference between primary and secondary sources, right? Primary sources are the things, the objects, the documents that are as close as possible to the event in question or are part of the event in question, that have just a minimum of gap between the thing, the place, the person, the occurrence, as possible. You want to get the stuff, the raw stuff of that moment. And I think of examples like letters that somebody might have written, diaries, photographs, testimonies and court transcripts, often fall under the category of primary sources. Police records, even though they come a little bit after, those can be essential parts, of a case, obviously, especially if time has passed between the murder and, you're looking at it. You've got deeds, land grants, ledgers, census data, official proceedings, government records, all the stuff that pertains to the thing that you're writing about. The closer you get to that thing or to that person, the more likely it is you're dealing with a primary source. And those tend to be more reliable, more valuable, and more useful as you're writing about your case. So that's primary. We'll talk about secondary in a sec, but you have primary sources. I mean, you've got a ton of them that you've got to work with, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, they're the interviews with the parents or the father, chief of police who was there that day, Special Agent Torsney. The issue is, there's so much. Like, I'm over like 150,000 words, and it's just too much, and you can't do that. I mean, it's like Quentin Tarantino writing his screenplays. The first draft's always like 4 hours long. It's crazy because he's got so much going on in his head. And for me, it's not so much that I've written, because it's a true crime story. And with true crime, like you said, you let the sources kind of tell the story, and you don't do much of your own editorializing or whatever. You don't put in your own 2 cents that often. And, like when you mentioned court transcripts before, think about the Accidental Billionaires, which led to the movie Social Network. That was Ben Mesrick, and all that stuff that he's sitting in the law office being deposed all really happened. I mean, they probably tweaked some things here and there, but that's some really solid stuff. And man, that makes a difference. It really makes a difference in what people will take from that story.
Oh man, we just had on Crime Capsule a couple weeks ago, we just had a guest named Maurice Jenkins who was doing research on the massacre of his own family members, his own ancestors in South Georgia back in the early 1900s. And, what does he find when he is in the courthouse in Early County, Georgia, but the lone surviving copy of the court transcript of, the trial and who was being tried for the murders of his own ancestor. I mean, you find the one thing and suddenly you're catapulted back in time 100 years. And it is absolutely breathtaking, those moments. It just doesn't get better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I did a case just recently about, it was from the 1890s, because it was a distant relative of mine from northern Michigan who was gunned down and crazy circumstances. He was a doctor, and the primary sources that I could get to, were through Ancestry and that kind of stuff. And I just think it's really intriguing to go back and look at how cases were reported on back then, and if it's really changed all that much. I mean, if I showed you some of the articles from 1890, you could very well think they were written today. It's the circumstances, the violence that occurred, they were serving a search warrant. Well, not a search warrant. They were serving a warrant for overdue taxes. And this guy who owned the mill didn't want to pay and shot the one sheriff, undermarshal, or whatever he was. And that was, first degree murder right there. And then he shot my distant relative, Dr. Frank Thurber, and ended up doing 10 years in jail. But even though he had a life sentence, and it was all because of having friends in high places. It's just nothing changes all that much.
Yeah. And the newspapers are a funny one to look at because they often blur the line between primary and secondary sources, especially the further back you go. There's a lot more overt bias in newspaper accounts.
Oh, sure.
Pre say 1940, 1950.
I'd even say in the 1970s they were still referencing, gay, LGBT stuff. It was terrible. I mean, it was just the way that they would headline stories, and it was that, their sexuality was somehow part of the story, and it's that's not part of the story. If it's not part of the story, it's not part of the story. So
no, of course.
So I see that again. I see that stuff, and I'm like, man, it's you thought we changed a little bit, but yeah, you're right. Going way back in the day, definitely not the politically correct stuff that we see.
The worst one that I've seen to date dates from about the 1930s in South Mississippi, where I wrote my book. And it was, the height of Jim Crow or whatever. But there was an instance in which, in the small town of Macomb, Mississippi, an African-American man was walking across the rail tracks at a certain point, and I think he might have been deaf, and he did not hear the oncoming train, and it struck him and killed him, unfortunately. But the very, very racist-owned newspaper in the area simply published an article with a headline titled, and this is a direct quote, "Macomb Negro Hits Train," period. That's it.
Yeah.
And you're just like, what do you say that? But newspapers are interesting because they do blur that line between primary and secondary sources. Sometimes they're all you have, the further back you go, and you have to use those to kind of get down to the little, you have to sift through the information in the article, biased and warped and skewed though it may be, in order to get to the little nuggets of truth that are going to help you tell your story. Now, for the benefit of your listeners who may not, again, be familiar with this distinction, let's talk about secondary, because secondary is huge, right? The definition of a secondary source is any source which is basically someone coming later and speaking about a primary incident or source in some way. So that includes like a scholarly book, an article, synthesis of data, what they call white papers or gray papers in industry, unpublished analyses of things. That's secondary sources. Memoir is also a secondary source, although you can kind of treat memoir like journalism, and it kind of blurs the line a little bit.
Sure.
But even things like, theses and dissertations, all secondary sources. And, it's really important to make a hard distinction where possible between the stuff of the thing itself and people coming later to talk about the thing, because that distinction is the foundation on which a lot of investigative journalism and historical research stands.
So would that include like press conferences and, that kind of stuff, or is that more of a primary source?
I think that those are a little tricky. I mean, it depends on what's being communicated at the press conference and whether it's intended to actually disclose or whether it's intended to stall and punt the football downfield.
Fair point. I mean, I do when there's a good press conference and a worthy press conference, I have that presser of the week, side show that I do and kind of talk about, what the latest break in the cold case or, like tomorrow, well, when this airs, it will already have been out there, but the press conference tomorrow for the Gilgo Beach murders. And I've covered that case since, I've been podcasting, and it's, those press conferences, you actually glean some interesting information from them. And I think from what I've seen online, they're going to have probably another connection to more victims, is my guess, because it sounds like it's a big deal, and he's going to be present in court, and they're going to hold a press conference afterwards. So I'll probably do a presser of the week on that. So it's just interesting, those press conferences, of what they say and what they don't say, like what you were talking about with stalling. It's
always,
we've seen it with the John Bonet case. They did that forever. There are lots of cases that you could say that they're punting the ball down the field. I mean, they did that in the Delphi case for a long time, I think. And I mean, just an interesting side note, just as a former member of the press.
It is. And, you have to be on guard. Of course, investigative journalists such as yourself, you guys know that you never, ever take anything that anyone says, at face value. The grain of salt is permanently, added to the discursive soup. But, the kind of thing that I find helpful here is trying to judge whether a story is still unfolding, as Gilgo is, right? And certain things have to be, kept under wraps so that they don't contaminate the integrity of the investigation, versus, you reading that court transcript from the 1890s and realizing that, these statements that were made, well, they are now part of the historic record in a different way with the passage of time than the thing that's happening just down the street at the county courthouse is. There is this kind of interesting process that happens with time where the same type of information morphs in our appraisal of it, and that's just based on the context and based on our reasons for accessing it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been done in the Madeleine McCann case, and I'm sorry, Madeleine McCann. I don't know.
Maddie. Yeah,
we'll
of course.
Just say Maddie. I mean, her case, they've had all these different press conferences. They've got this guy that he's in jail, and, it's like, well, do they? Are they just doing this because, again, like just new eyes are on it, so they're saying, they're putting it back out in the public? I mean, some of those cases, like I just had Elaine Tassi from Colorado Public Radio on to talk about a case from 2017 here in Denver, or a suburb of Denver. And, when there's like not a lot of information out there, it's like people just start to speculate, and, speculation is just can be a rabbit hole you don't want to go down that can actually screw up investigations, in my opinion.
It can. I was still living overseas in the UK when Maddie was, when she disappeared. So for years, I was doing all my graduate work over there, and for years, any, whisper of any development in the case was suddenly blared at, like 40-point type in the heading of every single red top tabloid in British journalism. Just like the Sun, the Mirror, the Star, all these red tops, as they're called, the little penny papers that just thrive on BS and yelling.
Back in the days, the news of the world.
Of course. Like anytime anything, came up with Maddie, it was just like all over the papers the next day, maximum volume. And it didn't matter if it was true or not. It didn't matter if the police would revoke it, the following week. They didn't care. It was just make sure that we're yelling about this as loudly as possible, which of course means like, scaring off anybody who might, want to come forward and contribute something genuine, because it's like, well, their life is going to be ruined, right, if they have anything to say. And there was some speculation back in the day that the way that the tabloid journalism covered that particular case did contaminate the investigation and did interfere with police operations across the European continent. So,
Yeah, 100% agree. I mean, we talked, and I mentioned John Bonet. I mean, that case, talk about tabloid fever here in the U.S. I mean, that is absolutely a case that still to this day they're making documentaries that are pulling in millions of viewers on Netflix and Peacock, and it's just, I don't know. Some cases just resonate with people, and John Bonet's case, Maddie's case, you could say white girl, a little white girl thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole news issue, and why certain cases get the publicity that they do.
Absolutely.
And what it boils down to is a lot of times race, unfortunately, or what the actions of that individual were. I know that like the Atlantic City Four, they were all sex workers, or most of them were sex workers and are into drugs, and the fact that they were in that lower class of people, I don't think their cases get nearly the attention that, say, somebody in the middle class or somebody from the suburbs gets murdered, and it's like, all hands on deck.
Always the case, and that's one of the sad realities of the system that we live in. You and I could talk for 2 hours just about Luigi Mangione, those disparities, like right now. I do want to return to the primary secondary thing just one last time, though, because I encountered something which, when I was researching my book on the history of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which was extremely illuminating as to why we need to keep our grain of salt on hand at all times, why we need to keep the chip on our shoulder a little bit too, as investigators, as researchers, trying to make sense out of the stories that we're telling. There are always aspects of the historical record, whether it's from 1989 or 1899 or the year 9, that we're having to sift through to get down to the truth, right, or as close as we can to it. And I'm just going to tell you a quick story about one that really kind of showed me the importance of the critical, independent assessment being so necessary. So the founder of the city that I was writing about is a guy named William Hardy. Okay, by all accounts, he was a pretty industrious, 19th century guy in Mississippi. He was a self-taught lawyer. He did fight in the Civil War. But he also was a state legislator and ended up founding 3 cities and built a railroad. I mean, he was a pretty busy dude, right? And as far as Mississippi history goes, like, pretty influential. Well, he also was a soldier in the Civil War, and you know who he was fighting for. So Hardy goes on to have this illustrious career, lives a long time, has a bunch of wives, a bunch of grandkids, builds these cities, et cetera, et cetera. And he dies in the early 1900s. The number of letters that we have from Hardy dates to about just under 200. And as part of the research for my book, I had to read them all. And most of the ones that we have, the vast majority of the ones that we have, are stored in a special collections library in Hattiesburg, which was the second city that he founded. And I had to read them all just to know exactly who I was dealing with. Okay, I'll make this quick. There's a collection of the letters, and then there's a collection of the transcriptions of the letters, because his handwriting's terrible. It's really hard to read. Okay, it needs deciphering. Well, I was going through doing my research, just reading one after another, and something sat funny with me when I finished reading all of the transcribed letters. And Bill, it was this. It was that weirdly, I don't even know how I caught it. It just was bizarre when I was looking at the sort of archival book of the actual documents. I realized that the numbers didn't match up. Okay. And the person who had transcribed these letters from the terrible handwriting was like some early judge in South Mississippi history, some guy in the 1900s who just took it on himself, maybe 1930s, took it on himself after his good buddy William Hardy died, to just make those transcriptions and leave them for posterity. Well, I just happened to notice that the number of letters that Hardy wrote was not the same number as had been transcribed, right? And I see like not exactly smoking gun yet, but I'm starting to get some whiffs of gunpowder, like something's happened. So I go back and look through the archives again, start from the top and go one by one until I finally find this one letter that had not been transcribed. I found where the numbers got out of sync. All right. Would you like to guess what that letter was?
No, I don't know.
Well, when I tell you, you would have guessed this. I'll put it that way. It was a letter that he wrote in the early 1860s. He was fighting in the Civil War at the time. I think it was 1863. He was out in Maryland or somewhere, and he had been wounded, injured, and was ill, was not actually fighting, but was still able to correspond with his wife back in Mississippi at the time. Here's what's interesting. It wasn't even the full letter. It was a scrap. It was a piece of paper that had been damaged, so we only had part of it. But the part of it that we had in his handwriting, which by that time I was able to read, was instructions to his then wife, it was his second wife at the time, instructions to his wife to beat and whip one of their own slaves for harboring a runaway from a nearby plantation. All right. Now, this may not surprise us. This is a white landowner in the South in the 1860s. He
Sure.
probably had slaves. But what this is the only hard evidence. This is the smoking gun that William Hardy, illustrious legislator and landowner and city founder and railroad builder, was a slave owner. It's the only piece of evidence that we have in existence that he owned slaves. And what is interesting to me about it, so that's a primary source right there. The secondary source that came after him, note how that judge, his buddy, tried to conceal that fact from the historic record by making sure that that was the only letter that was not transcribed for posterity. He didn't destroy the letter, but he certainly did not include it in the quote-unquote official transcription of Hardy's letters. And, it's just things like that, when you're doing this kind of research that require you to keep that grain of salt. I like to think of it as the whole salt shaker with you at all times.
Yeah, I mean, you never know what you're going to find. I think when you get down into the, finding that transcript, you just never know. And you've always heard the old expression, "Oh, there was a flood or a fire." It's always one of the
flood, the flood in the police archives, always the flood
and the fire. Come on, we know. Yeah. Bessie is knocking over the fire, the flame and
Yep.
burning down Chicago, and oh man, all those records are just gone. We don't know, but the funny thing about all that stuff is people just don't know where anything really is once it's like out of the possession of the original owner, or a library or a museum or something along those lines. That stuff, one day it could be found. And I mean, there's that place in freaking Turkey or wherever that's got all those books, and there's like 1 million books or something there from like way back when, and they've only been able to like interpret like 2% or something crazy like that.
Yeah,
it's
you're
like,
thinking
what the hell is
Herculaneum.
what is in those books?
Yeah, the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum. Yeah, they've only just started to use, like
AI.
MRIs and lasers and AI to, like check the carbonization of the ink molecules against the original papyrus that would then enable them to create sort of like density clouds that resemble letters. I was just reading the article about it earlier this morning because it's really interesting.
It's so interesting. I mean, when you think about all that history that could be unlocked with that.
Yeah, and
that discovery. Yeah, I know. It's just,
and will be.
It's so interesting to think, like, what were they writing? Because that is a lot of text. I mean, we're not talking like, this would make a library look like somebody's private collection.
No, it's great. I'm so excited about that kind of stuff. It really does keep me up at
so
night reading
cool.
those articles. It's the very best. But you're right. We never know exactly what we have. Or if we do know what we have, we also know that we don't know the extent of what we have. And that point was made never more clear to me, again, in the civil rights violence and murder context than hearing the incredible journalist whose work I know Jerry Mitchell, was investigating, the murders of Medgar Evers and, like all these figures back in the 90s. He reopened the cold cases of the civil rights leaders' assassinations.
Yes.
And in the course of his work, it's now published in his book, Race Against Time, he learns, he goes and finds out that the state archives, I forget exactly which specific unit, but the rifle, the murder weapon that Edgar Ray Killen had used to assassinate Medgar Evers, had just been lost for 40 years until someone decided to just go and look for it, and lo and behold, it was in evidence lockup. It's just, we still had the damn thing, and no one, one of the most important artifacts in all of state history, and people had just forgotten it was there until he went sniffing, and then there it was with a tag on it on the shelf. And on the basis of that, among other things, he got Edgar Ray Killen convicted, retried and convicted, and the dude died in jail for what he had done. And it's like,
Justice.
Sometimes you just never know. Right, exactly. You never know what you have until you start going after it. So,
and very different note, but it's a sad note. It's like when they discovered all those rape kits in Chicago, and just were sitting in Detroit, and they were all over. All these different cities have these backlogs of all these kits that have never been tested, and it's like, what are we doing in society that we're not going to do the actual thing that these women went and actually experienced, and then we're just going to put it in a warehouse and not deal with it? I think that's absolutely garbage. And, like, something really needs to be looked at as far as that process of testing. It just doesn't seem to be working.
I know. And for researchers who are coming after the fact, sometimes you have to write a book or do a project or, script out a show, and you just don't have all the information that is ultimately pertinent to the case. You just have to go with what you have at the time. Now, that raises the question, of course, and I know this is something that you are working with on Amy's book, is how do you make sense of it all, right? Like when you start to accumulate all your different sources, you got your primary laid out, you got those kind of sorted and organized, you've got your secondary sources and what's been said later, and you've got those kind of triangulated. When you have the massive material at hand, how do you organize it? And what I found was most helpful, and I hope this is useful to folks out there, because when you're dealing with the overwhelming volume, you really need a system. And so I ended up using, and have for years on projects like this, a twofold method, okay? And what it is the combination of two types of storylines. It's a timeline, otherwise a chronology, I should say. Let me refer to it that way. You have a chronology, and then you have an outline. And those two things overlap, but they're not identical. And so the idea is the chronology is the hard timeline of the things that happened in your case. And that can be down to the day, the hour, the minute, right? And every time you learn something which is a hard fact about what you're researching, you put it in that chronology in order, scrupulously in order, so that you can see the events as they unfold one by one, okay? And every time you put it in there, you also put in where you found it to make sure that you don't forget. I'll come back to that. But then, so your chronology is, like they used to say in Jorge Luis Borges' short stories, the only accurate map of the territory is the territory itself, right? It's that kind of principle. You want to construct the most accurate map of the territory by getting as much of the territory in there as possible. But then your map through is your timeline, right? And that is, your outline. The outline of the book, the outline of the story, the outline of the script, or whatever it is not identical with the chronology of the events. The outline is the way that you are going to tell the story, which uses the material from the chronology, but which is framing it in your own unique way. And so what I found in researching and writing the Hattiesburg book and other projects is that if you have your chronology as airtight and accurate as possible, you almost always start to see the storylines which go into your book outline or your chapter outline emerge. So the two are always in conversation with one another, right? If something happens, if you learn a new fact, you put it in the chronology, and then you also put it into your outline, but it often goes in a slightly different place, right? If your outline changes in a way that requires a new aspect of framing of the case, then you go back to your chronology and you hunt for those relevant storylines within it, and you amass the narrative that you need. So anyway, all that is to say, the two tools that I have found most helpful as you're making sense out of all the information that you have, they're like conversation partners. First, it's your chronology, the hard facts, and second is your outline, which is the way that you're going to tell the story of your event.
Yeah, I think that's a very good method, and one that would keep you on track as far as, just knowing what you have in front of you, like you said. And I do feel like the timeline is such an important aspect of things. I actually wish there was a good app or a good program
or something.
Yeah, where you can make a good timeline and actually add information to it, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but I haven't seen it. But I would love it.
Mine is called Microsoft Word. I just do it as old fashioned as possible.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll tell you this, Bill. When I was researching that book, I actually hand wrote, because sometimes you can only take a notebook and a pencil into an if it's a really important archive, that's all they let you take in. But I kept 4 spiral notebooks of all the primary sources that I was looking at when I was researching that book. And in that, anytime I would learn anything that was relevant, I would write down the relevant thing in the notebook, and then, as though it were welded to my arm, I would then write with another pencil, a different colored pencil, where I found it. Because I guarantee anyone out there who is listening to this, I guarantee you, I will bet you $10, I will bet you a lunch at Commander's Palace here in New Orleans, I will bet you anything that as you research and write, you will forget where you found something. Everyone does. And the more meticulous you can be whenever you learn anything of interest about putting down where, when, and what archive, what call number, whatever it is, the more meticulous you are in that part of the process, the more successful you will be in retrieving it later and ensuring that you've done your work. So,
yeah, I think everybody has that issue where you kind of start and then you get to a point where you're kind of lost and you don't really know where you really started from, and then everything kind of gets bungled together is the way
it's overwhelming. I mean, you're swimming in a huge sea. Yeah. I mean, you've got 150,000 words on the page and you're like, okay, where did I get that one quote from that one interview?
Yeah.
Holy crap. There's no way a human brain can recall everything quite like that. So,
yeah, there are certain things I remember, but like a long quote or, something like that. It's so good to have the transcripts of those interviews that I did. That's just a luxury. I like to use. Have you ever used the app Scrivener?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Scrivener. It's helpful. I mean,
it's good for organizing.
I guess I'm old school, so I just use Word, but Scrivener's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know, it's a nice kind of way to organize, and I feel like it was a worthy purchase, and I don't mind it, and it does help me organize as far as, it's not a timeline, it's a vertical timeline to a degree, but I just feel like Scrivener helps me with organizing stuff. And I mean, like when I wrote screenplays, Final Draft, you use that, or you'd use I think Magic Movie Screenwriter was what I originally used, but those two were basically formatting apps. They were just format the screenplay for you, and you wouldn't have to worry about all the different margins and stuff like that. And it was just
good
amazing.
Tools.
Good tools.
Very good tools. Very good tools. Yeah.
Note cards, that just like digital note cards, because that's a good way to organize as well, is just keep your facts and, in certain places is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Ducks in a row.
Yeah, keep your ducks in a row.
A couple of years ago, this was a little after my Hattiesburg book came out, I had the opportunity to help an emerging researcher. She had a PhD that was accepted as a book by Cambridge University Press, and so she asked me for some help in just kind of, doing that conversion process. She used EndNote, and EndNote is a good program that can be very powerful. I think it may be a little too powerful for its own good sometimes. It's kind of like
I had trouble with it.
Yeah, like if you are driving an F-350, but all you're doing is really going back and forth to the grocery store, do you really need all those supercharged cylinders? It's up to you. Make your call. But EndNote is powerful and can.
That's all dependent on where you live, as you know, Ben.
Yeah, that's true. If you're going up a 40-degry incline every day to that grocery store, right?
Or if you just live in the South,
get you that NOS, baby. Rev it up.
I'm sure you have plenty of double. Dualies down in New Orleans.
We got dualies
rolling around that aren't doing what dually trucks are meant to do.
Oh yes, sir. No, absolutely. Most of those are hauling boat trailers, actually. But anyway,
fair enough. They did, but big truck energy there.
Big truck energy. So deep south, you're going to have it. But no, I think all of those assets, all those programs that you're describing, Scrivener and the screenplay one and EndNote and so forth, they all have their place. The point is, if you're ever doing this kind of long form storytelling in any genre, in any domain, you have to be organized about your sources, because if you do not take care of them, they will not take care of you when it comes time to publish, to release, to get your stuff out there. And it's just it really is a very mutual relationship there. It's like someone can haul you in for fabrication, or worse. I mean, there's a lot of risks of not being on top of your source material there. So but I find that working with those two, I think of it as scaffolding on a building, right? Like the scaffolding is the thing that builds the building, and then once you're done building, you take the scaffolding down. Your chronology is one part of your scaffolding. Your story outline is the other part of your scaffolding, and those two together can build that structure and leave it in pretty good shape. So I hope that's useful to folks. It does raise the question, though, once you've built it, what do you do with it? Right? How do you start to get it out there? How do you start to propose it and give this work the beginnings of its public life? There are a lot of answers to that question. I know this is something that you're beginning to, to grapple with as you near the later stages of your own writing process. I think the most useful answer I can give to anybody out there who's interested in, okay, we've made most of the sausage, say, but we need to start thinking about, like, where are we going to sell the sausage, right? Yeah. Like who wants to buy it and how are they going to find it?
Fair analogy.
Sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, down in New Orleans, we eat a lot of sausage. It's a Creole thing, so I'm comfortable running with that all the way. Anyway, I should probably refrain from putting in too many personal plugs of my favorite sausage makers that go back to the 1820s that all have like French last names, but. Anyway. One thing that I find incredibly helpful, and this comes from my years working with a publisher of history books, Arcadia Publishing, History Press, and so forth, is, they have proposals that are out there that talk about all the different aspects of the public life of your book. But the single most important one that everybody wants to know, if you're going to be pitching a project to somebody, and you know this because you've already said it 45 minutes ago with respect to who's already been out there working on Amy's case, right? The number one most important thing you have to pitch, you have to say as part of your pitch is, what else is out there? What else has already been done? What is your literature review? What are your comps? And that's the publishing kind of term for it, is like, what are the comparable titles that are already out there that have started to cover this landscape? And then most crucially, how is yours different? What are you bringing to the table that's new, that's original, that's undiscovered, that's untold, that's been forgotten, that's been overlooked, that's been buried? You see what I'm getting at. Like, you have to know who's written and published what, and then you also have to know and say very clearly how yours is different. There's nothing more important than that to a book publisher. Nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely the most important aspect of getting your work out there. You're done with the project, or you're in the middle of the project and you want to know where you're going with this. And, it could be a book, it could be a podcast. You never know. Sometimes it could be both. I mean, we've seen, TV shows come out with, partner podcasts that have after show discussions about the series, and it's like it's just cool to have new mediums being created, whether it's stupid TikTok videos or podcasts, but like you see it with like short videos, the TikTok video of true crime, like that's a thing. Like there are people out there that follow all that stuff, and hey, that's probably something that we should all be doing, but who knows if they're taking your information? I don't know. I'm not going to go into the TikTok dilemma, but you are touching on a really important question, which is like, do you intend the work that you're doing to be primarily entertainment or education, right? Like, are you trying to like amuse and kind of like delight people, or are you trying to actually make a contribution to a case? And in your particular instance, one of the things that I really value about the work that you're doing on Amy's book, on Amy's case, is the fact that you have direct personal connections to the area. You have deep local knowledge. You're not kind of parachuting in from the outside, but you're actually trying to make a real difference to those for whom this was deeply traumatic, troubling, and has haunted the area for 40 years. And it's sort of like you have a personal investment in the story. You need an absolute personal investment as a member of that community, and your work is not designed, to just titillate or give people like something to do while they're waiting on catching their bus, or, like on the subway, just kind of like watching stupid stuff to pass the time. You're trying to do something very different. I think there is a lot of bite-sized stuff out there which can be fun, but as always, grain of salt. We have to recognize what is just fun and then what is actually trying to do something more. Yeah, I definitely feel that there is a fine line to be drawn between what we do is, trying to create content that's interesting to people, as well as providing a service, semi-service to the family, and doing them justice by, not exploiting their case and not speculating about what could be this or could be that. And I think with the Amy book, as it is a work in progress, with your concentric circles and, some of your research methods, I definitely feel like, I'll personally probably take on some of those as well, and adapt them into my own writing and research, because that's essential, and you got to be able to cut the fat. And I've always known that with screenwriting is, you got to be able to kill your darlings. That's
always.
That's a famous expression, and it's like, you can tell in a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows, a lot of books, when something just seems off. It's like, well, they just couldn't pull themselves to do it. They couldn't get themselves to say, this doesn't belong, even though I love this person and this character.
No.
It's
story
like,
bloat. Yeah.
It's totally it's a thing. It can
bad.
be, yeah.
It's bad. Story bloat is very painful for both writer and reader and viewer.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna say The Sopranos wasn't a great show, and it was a great show, but I feel like there was a lot of story bloat within that series because of the fact that it was kind of HBO's cash cow for a solid decade, and
gotta milk it if you're at that level.
Unfortunately, but luckily at the same time, The Wire came out, and that is the best TV show.
It's as lean as it gets. Absolutely. And that's the goal.
Connects the dots from season 1, episode 1 to season 5, episode 10. It's all
so satisfying.
It's such the full circle. It's such a great series. I've always said, if anybody's not seen it, it's worth your time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that at this point I also have to put a plug in as I'm thinking about kind of like where we get our stuff, how we make sense out of it, how we begin to kind of think about its effects in the community, and how we draw on community support to sort of validate and enliven our work as we research these things. I can't come onto this show and not put in a plug for libraries and librarians, and public libraries in particular, because they are one of the greatest assets that this country has, our public libraries, and librarians, especially in local areas. If you're doing a research project on something that happened near you, these people tend to be just so committed and dedicated to their material. They also know their holdings, which they may put you on to something that you've never heard of before. I'll give you an example. When I was writing the Hattiesburg history book, I went to the local public library. Hattiesburg's a mid-sized southern city. It's in that sort of 40 to 50,000 range. Okay, it's got a university. It's no Knoxville or Atlanta. We're not talking 6 figures of population, but it's decently sized for a small southern state. Anyway, went over to the public library and was starting to introduce the research to them and the work that I was doing, and of course they get on board immediately because they love that kind of stuff. But then one of them says, we've got some stuff that nobody's ever looked at before. And Bill, when somebody says that, every light on the dashboard starts blinking hard green. It's like set thrusters to full, like engage afterburners. You mean there's new material? There's a what? And so they took me to a file cabinet. No, actually, it was 3 file cabinets of material that librarians in their system had simply been collecting about area history because they thought it was interesting. They'd been collecting this material for 30 years. They had 3 file cabinets of just clippings, documents, surveys, anything that came out that one of the city's own librarians just looked cool. They took it, they stuck it in a file cabinet, and they just filed it away for later. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I read every single sheet of paper in every single one of the folders in every single one of those cabinets, and I found sources that do not exist anywhere else except but for the pluck and the wisdom of that random person clipping it out, saving it, and then tucking it away. And I was able to get material that literally would not exist otherwise. Make use of your libraries. If anyone out there is doing a research project, a storytelling project, a long form piece, a whatever, go talk to your librarians, tell them about it, introduce yourself, get them on board, and you have no idea what good can come out of that. It's just extraordinary. Yeah,
I mean, I can say that James Renner's stuff is down at the Kent State University archives. I've been down there, looked at the files, and been through that. And Sam Shepard's case from Bay Village, the same city Amy was killed. his files are down at the Cleveland State Historical Society, and so that's just a cool resource to have. The historical societies, the libraries, the universities, the local universities. They have stuff that your local library won't have, and maybe more advanced stuff. But again, it's there for you to take and learn from. And
absolutely, go and look at the theses. Go into the criminology department. Go to the criminal justice department. Go to the history department. In your area universities, and like as not, there might be something on the case that you're writing about, because folks who are invested in local history tend to keep their materials close-ish to home or deposit them in these local institutions. And, you just never know what might be there. But you get somebody, who's behind the desk there, aware of what you're working on. And I'm going to use a little Southernism here. I guarantee you that they're going to be thinking about it in their off time. And if they come across a source that is useful for you, that librarian 9 times out of 10 is going to hold it aside for you, or email you and tell you they found it, or be like, hey, I ran across this. You want to come take a look? And they will help you do your work. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is just remarkable to see that level of commitment. But it's there, and because you've been into those places, and you see like how people get interested in the case that you're working on too.
Yeah, and again, just take advantage of what we have to offer that's free. I mean, there's just nothing that beats our library system, and the access to knowledge is there, and it's at your fingertips. So,
Yep.
I always agree that you should explore your local library, and even if you don't like to, do the physical books, you can get the audio apps, and your local library has a connection, and you just need a library card. And you can listen to audiobooks for free and not have to pay Audible.
Also free.
And you don't have to pay Audible $15 a month for one book. It's
That's right.
This doesn't make any sense. But yeah, the Libby app, I shout out to that, and shout out to all librarians, because again, like you said, they will help you do your work, and they enjoy it. And it's something
they do.
They go to school for. They have to go through a lot of schooling for their jobs, and there's a reason for it. And I think, like you said, it's a great resource, and you should use it.
Absolutely. And, they can also help you, just back to the point about what you do with your stuff once you've got it all together. How do you, get that sausage out there to sell it or help people find it? I mean, they have ideas about what makes, a project distinctive, and where to market it, and where to, promote it and publicize it, because, they are invested in community knowledge, and they want new, good research and storytelling out there, benefiting the community. So it's really kind of a package deal, when you walk in there. But I don't know. I hope this is helpful. It can sometimes feel daunting when you're trying to do a big research project and you're not exactly sure where to start. But I often think about just like those steps in this sequence. I think about, okay, what kind of story am I trying to tell? I try to think, what do the sources out there give me? What kind of sources do we have? What's been said about them? How do I make sense out of them? Once I start to evaluate that, and that can be a period that takes months, but that's part of it, then I start to think about, okay, how am I going to make sense out of this volume? And I get my tools in place. I get my chronology, and I get my outline, my storyline outline, right? And then, only then, do I start to, once that is underway, do the actual writing process, which leads to publication. But there are, like you said earlier, there are distinct steps. Sometimes they shade into one another a little bit, and that's okay. But there are distinct steps, and I think kind of following that path can get you through the forest, pretty well.
Yeah. I think this has been helpful for me, and helpful, I think, for the listeners who are interested in this type of project, or, podcast, book, that type of thing. I think this has been a good resource for people to use as a starting point if they want to dip their toes in the waters. And Ben,
well,
that's awesome.
Well, delighted. And I'm going to just put on my listener of Bill's show hat and say that we are all, of course, excited about the work that you're doing on Amy's case and can't wait to read that book, when it finally comes out. It is a process. It is a journey. And, that's a part of it. I mean, these things cannot be rushed, but we know that you're going to have a lot to contribute there. And it's going to be really, really cool to see when you do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's
excited.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to say you're not excited, but it's like you said, it's daunting, and it's whittling down, and you want to be accurate, and you want to be what's the word I'm thinking of? You want to be respectful of the family and the people that are involved, because it wasn't just the family, but it was also the investigators. It was the family's friends, the teachers in her school, principal. All those people are impacted, and it's like you just don't want to do something that's shoddy or half-assed, because at the end of the day, you're really just trying to push the envelope or push the meter, needle, whatever, forward, because you need to get answers to these questions. And there's DNA stuff that they've got out there, but again, it boils down to technology. And so when that occurs, I don't know, we'll see, but I'm looking forward to it. But I do also understand that it's an overwhelming and sometimes daunting task. So
you'll find your way through, and sometimes the material itself tells the story for you. And I'm sure there are lots of contributions that are just waiting to appear, right then and there. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing them. But there are plenty of other resources out there. I just hope that these basic tools are useful, and if we can maybe return to that final. I know I've gotten like 6 metaphors deep now, but like if we go back to the sausage, I hope this helps people find something that's delicious, and that they really enjoy eating. So there we go.
Awesome. Well, I do appreciate you sharing the knowledge that you have gained over the years of researching and writing, and I do think the audience will definitely get something out of this. We did talk about true crime cases and some of the cases that have been covered and, or oversaturated, and there's a lot to do to that. And I think the more the technology gets to where it needs to be, I think a lot of these cases will be solved. But we have 250,000 unsolved cases out there, and not enough people working on it. That's the bottom line, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, hopefully this will, help anybody who is out there trying to attack a case and doesn't know exactly how to start. That's my hope, is that this gives somebody some equipment to do that. I really appreciate your letting me come on and hang out for an hour and talk through this stuff. I love methods. I love methods. I think methods are just like some of the most interesting things that we can discuss when it comes to research, and it's a subject that just never gets old. So it's a real joy to kind of come in and dwell on it for a little while. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on and doing this. I think this was great for me, and thank you again.
My pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
Well, absolutely. You have a great day, and enjoy the holiday.
Thanks, man. Hey, look, if you guys can send us a little snow down here in New Orleans, it's like the middle of December and it's 75 degrees outside, and I'm just hurting. I'm hurting, man. Like anything you got, just send it our way.
Honestly, in Denver, it's pretty dry right now. It hasn't snowed in a couple weeks, so the mountains are kind of getting parched, but hopefully while I'm gone, they'll re-up on the snow up in the mountains. But I'll do my best to bring some your way. But
appreciate that. Fingers crossed. I'll send you some of that 1800s era last French name, good sausage that we've been talking about in return. Right. So is that a deal? Can we do that?
That's a deal. Sounds like a plan.
Done.
Appreciate it, Ben. Thanks.
Thanks, man. See you soon.
Yeah, see ya.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time for yet another special bonus episode in the middle of our holiday grab bag series. We're taking a week off for Christmas, and we'll be back after the holidays with all new content, continuing our interviews with the hottest true crime authors working today. Happy holidays, everybody. See you soon. Thanks to our producer, Bill Huffman, our production director, Bridget Coyne, audio engineer, Sean Rule Hoffman, and our executive producers, Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Crime Capsule is a production of Evergreen Podcasts and a signature title of the Killer Podcasts Network. You can find Crime Capsule wherever you listen to podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcasts.com.
When it's PCS time, you know the drill. Pack, research the new base, get the kids in school, because family supports family. At American Public University, we support military families with flexible, affordable online education that moves with you. As a military spouse, your tuition rate is the same as your partner's, just $250 per credit hour. American Public University, education that moves with you. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.
High Five Casino is a social casino with real prizes and big Vegas hits at highfivecasino.com. The hottest games right from Vegas, and all winnings go straight to your bank account. Hundreds of exclusive games, free daily rewards, and come back to get free coins every 4 hours. Visit highfivecasino.com or download the High Five Casino app.
High Five Casino is a social casino. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Play responsibly. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details at high5casino.com.
High Five Casino.